Welcome back to another episode of the Giving Voice podcast. I'm Izzy.
And I'm Joe.
We are both first year speech and language therapy students at UCL and are really looking forward to interviewing Marie today. Marie is a speech and language therapist who until recently was head of the North Thames Regional Cleft Service, among other things, which we will get into later. Today we are going to be talking about specialising in cleft as a speech and language therapist, conducting research while practicing as a speech and language therapist, and opportunities to work with charities and go on international trips.
So, Marie, we have a range of people who listen to our podcast, some newly qualified speech and language therapists, students, and other who are interested in speech and language therapy. Could you give us a quick overview of what a cleft is and an SLT's role in supporting someone who has a cleft?
Of course, and Joe and Izzy and everyone, thank you very much for the invitation to join you today, and a great privilege to be able to share experiences and thoughts with you. So thank you very much for the invitation. So as you ask, what is a cleft? Well, primarily it's a gap which occurs either in the lip or the palate. It's in the early embryonic stages of the baby's development. And you can have either a unilateral cleft lip and palate, or a unilateral cleft lip when only the lip is involved, or the alveolus. You can have a bilateral cleft lip and palate, or an isolated cleft palate, and that can involve either the soft palate or the hard and soft palate as well. So they can occur. Obviously, 1 in 700 live births are known to have a cleft of some form. And our role as speech and language therapists is primarily to monitor and oversee the communication development of children with this condition. As you all know, as speech and language therapists and those who might be joining the profession, it is the role of the palate that separates the nose from the mouth for speech. So a really small part of our anatomy and our muscle function actually plays a significant role in us achieving the resonance that we need for speech. So what do speech and language therapists do for those who are affected by cleft? Primarily, we are looking at their palate function, but we're also looking at their language. Within their palate function, we're listening to their resonance and their airflow. But also as speech and language therapists, we're looking at their social communication, their expressive, receptive language, and primarily their speech production as well. So many components that play a significant role when we are profiling the communication of children and older people with clefts. And we know that a cleft can also be part of many syndromes. So you have to think about differential diagnosis, and you also have to think about what is the primary sort of the most functional impact on this, and what is the priority for therapy or intervention, and who do you need to reach out to for second opinions, etc. So it's primarily overseeing the communication and speech development of children affected by cleft. But also as speech and language therapists, we also look at dysphagia. And of course, mindful that they can be a part of a syndromic profile, we will also be looking at feeding and the dysphagia aspect as well for those patients. So that's us, that's what we do. I hope that gives you a clear overview.
So we know you have specialised in cleft lip and palate. We'd love to hear more about your journey into this specialism and why you chose it.
That's a really good question, Izzy. Why cleft and why speech? Well, my path was, as most of us, I started in the community, absolutely loved not knowing what was walking through the door, and it's a really great way of developing skills and really establishing your problem solving and your hypothesis when you're planning and intervention. So that was great, loved it, but then thought I should go into education and have a look at what does it feel like to work in a special school. So did that as well. And that was really the part that sort of triggered the interest in speech. So it was working in a special needs school, and many of the pupils and the young people there had cleft, but they were also part of another condition. So that was really my introduction into cleft and structure for speech. And then I went and worked within a smaller regional cleft service within Hertfordshire, where I lived. And then I moved across to head and neck cancer. So all this time I was moving towards structure and anatomy and speech, and that was really taking me in that direction. And ultimately went back to cleft, and then finally found myself in the really fortunate position to be joining the team at North Thames in November 2002. When all the reconfiguration of cleft services was established across the UK. So always about anatomy, always about structure, always about speech. So that was the path that I took. But the best grounding was in the community.
It's so interesting to hear, because I think a lot of us have that real interest in like the anatomy side of things, and I think we don't necessarily think of community being a starting point for that.
Yeah, I think it can be quite hard to see the links between the end goal of more niche specialism like cleft and how that pathway works to potentially like reaching working in that specialism. That's very interesting to hear. So from our research and what you've already said, we've seen there is a lot of multidisciplinary teamwork within Cleft and Palate. Could you tell us more about this?
Yeah, absolutely. Within a multidisciplinary team for caring for and looking after young people and babies and families too, because they're part of the team, are a huge multidisciplinary team. So, and they're actually vital for good outcomes. And we're not going to be discussing outcomes today, but they are a really key part in good care. So if you consider what the professions that are involved, so you'll have obviously speech and language therapy, you'll have nursing, surgery, you'll have surgeons, you'll have audiology, ENT, orthodontists, pediatric dentists, etc., psychologists, dysphagia therapists from speech and language therapy. So that team really looks after the patient across their pathway. So in the UK, care starts at the age of, really at initial diagnosis, and then we monitor our patients right the way through to the age of 20. So through that lifespan, or that sort of early years into early adulthood, there are many specialisms, and at key points along that care pathway, different specialisms will come into the patient's profile and their journey. So for speech and language therapy, for example, we get involved very early on, giving advice and information giving primarily at that point, unless, of course, there's a feeding issue that's related to dysphagia, and that's when we become involved in that. And then we move across around the age of about 2, and then at 3, we're really then profiling the children's speech development, as I alluded to earlier. And then in all of that is audiology. They're looking after their hearing, because as speech and language therapists, we know the impact of hearing and speech together. And so that is how the team sort of works together in those early years. And then we move across as teeth develops, and they move into pediatric dentistry, orthodontics, and will still be monitored with us because, of course, palate function needs to be monitored as well. So that is how we work as an MDT. And what is interesting when you work in a multidisciplinary team is that your professional priority may be very different to what the child or young person wants, but also what the other priorities are within the multidisciplinary team. But in all of that, it is the patient that is the most important aspect of that.
Of course.
They should drive the decision making. We give the information, but collectively and together as a collaboration, that's when we we reach the right next steps. And I suppose I would always come back to functional. What's functional for this? What's going to have the most impact and the most positive outcome?
Okay, so following from this, are there sort of like more specific examples of like what decisions the SRT would particularly be involved in, and like specialist information that you would be providing in these complex decisions?
Absolutely. So something that speech and language therapy lead on alongside with our surgical colleagues is looking at palate function for speech. So if a young person or a patient child came to us and we were assessing them and thinking, I'm hearing some nasality in their speech, we're hearing some what we call hypernasality, or we might be hearing some airflow, and we need to do some further investigations for this. So that takes two parts. There are objective assessments, so that will be through lateral videothoroscopy or endoscopy if that's clinically indicated, but also perceptual speech assessment, and we use a sentence repetition task that is used throughout the UK in order to really rate and assess palate function for speech. And it's very much a perceptual assessment, and that's very much the speech and language therapist's remit in order to report those findings to the surgical team. So perceptual assessment, absolutely speech and language therapy gold standard, and also videothoroscopy or endoscopy if we feel that is warranted. And that in collaboration with the surgeon and with the patient, we then make that sort of decision together. And also profiling what is the speech characteristics that we're hearing in the patient that might be related to cleft or might be related to something else, because there's always that differential diagnosis that you have to have in your thinking throughout that time. So yes, we call it our VPI service, velopharyngeal investigation, and that's a clinic that is really led by speech and language therapists and in consultation with our surgical colleagues.
Thank you.
So throughout our teaching, we're always referring to the evidence base. And I know a lot of people in our course are interested in going into research. I know you mentioned 2 different avenues of research that you've been involved in, both student projects looking at language and MRI studies into palate function.
Absolutely, Izzy, we have. And it's not just my work, it's the work of the team that I worked alongside and was very fortunate to work with. So the student projects are very much what UCL have really been working alongside with us at Great Ormond Street for some time. We've looked at many things. A while ago we looked at the expressive and receptive language profile of children with a cleft. We had to use clinical data. And as you know, clinical data can be messy, and that brings different challenges. But it was a really helpful way of us wanting to find out what are our patients telling us about their language development, and do our cohort, do our patients fit what's the large evidence base. So primarily it's an audit or it's a service evaluation, which are of equal value. I think we focus on research, and I'm using inverted commas here as a big umbrella, but there are many aspects that can really shape and direct clinical care, perhaps in a more timely timeline than long research. So if you want to know what your patients are telling you, service evaluation or audit are a really good place to start. And if I was a young researcher, they're a really good way of getting your understanding what you need to do in order to get good research methodology, because that's where most things fail. If the methodology isn't right, that's the challenge. So take your time and focus on that. And I would also say that there are grants out there, and it's a really great kudos if you can bring research grant money into your department that you're working in. It gives you some leverage to say, I'd like some time to do this. I'm bringing in some financial benefits that might cover my own salary or whatever. And so reach out to small charities reach out and look at that to see if there are opportunities for a really good way of bringing revenue and a research grant into your service. And that will also get you used to presenting your research profile. So often for research grants, you have to present your proposal, and that's a really good way of being challenged, because you have to get used to that too. So people aren't asking, sort of not challenging, but inquiring questions, wanting to explore that slightly more with you. And as long as you're open to that, then you will learn from that opportunity as well. So service valuation, audit, student projects, absolutely key. But the bigger stuff, go out to research grants and look at those as well.
Yeah, so for your research using MRI studies and palate function, could you tell us a bit more about this research, so sort of how it was conducted and what you found?
Sure, it was a collaboration with our imaging department at Barts and St Thomas's. We also had a link to, so we had to use their MRI equipment because we couldn't use that at Gosh. We also had surgeons involved, and we also had speech and language therapists, and we had a small research grant for our time, and also for supporting patients with their travel costs, because that's another element. And what we did was we brought patients who were going to have a submucous cleft palate surgery. So that's when, I haven't talked about that in detail, but that's when the muscles in the palate are not working effectively or need to be surgically repaired for, in some cases, if it's impacting on speech. So what we did was, for those patients who had been identified as having a submucous cleft palate, we're going to have MRI preoperatively and postoperatively. And the rationale for that was that MRI really helps our surgical colleagues to look at muscle function. So although we use lateral video fluoroscopy for our standard VPI investigations, the MRI was seen as another tool to help our surgical colleagues when they're looking at surgical planning and at their pre and post-op stage. So we did a whole range of students, young people from, the youngest was 5, and I don't know if you know what an MRI machine looks like, or MRI is, but it's quite noisy, and so we had to think about how we were going to actually get the patient to hear my instructions of when they were to speak and when they weren't going to speak. So these young people were lying in the MRI machine with headphones, with the noise going on behind them, which is the machine itself, and then me telling them or asking them when to say these certain sounds. So it was a bit of a logistical nightmare, and one that you couldn't really plan for until you were in it. So what did I learn is that you have to be prepared. You have to really think about that. And we also then discovered that that compliance, where we had always thought, actually, we can't do this with certain aged young people, you have to be older in order to do it. We discovered that we could actually do that with younger patients, and that it was a helpful tool in order for surgical planning. Now, that's in a research criteria. You then have to think about how that's going to be replicated into clinical practice. And then you're into a big discussion about resources, access to MRI, who pays for it, etc. So we've done the study, and there's more to do, I think, that others might take forward. But it's a really good example of when you do something in a research arena, how can you then take it to the next step?
Yeah. Have you started to see any clinical consequences of the study?
Not at the minute, no. But I think there's a lot in the US, and they're really looking at using MRI, but their health service is very different. Yeah. And a number of the cases are really on sort of single case. So we've got quite a large cohort we can really refer to. But it's the US have a really big team looking at that at the minute. I think we're just with them, but a little bit more work to be done.
Very interesting, thank you. So we've mentioned sort of already about the the fact that you have been doing research and clinical work and sort of supervising students. How is this sort of like balancing all this time work for you? Do you have sort of protected time to carry out research, or is it not as simple as that?
I wish it was as simple as that. And it's a question, if I put my manager's hat on, that I used to get asked quite a lot. And it's a conundrum. I think we have to be open and honest and say it is a conundrum, because we wish to be researchers, we wish to produce the evidence, but if you're working in a busy clinical environment, whether that's in the independent sector or within the NHS, it's very challenging. What would be my advice is to think about having these discussions when you're having your appraisal or your PDR. So you take this to your line manager, this is something I'm really interested in. Can we look at my job plan? Is there any possibility that I can be given some protected time in order to do this? Have a Gantt chart, know exactly what you're expecting, go in prepared for that discussion, but also to think about what would be the benefit in this that you're doing for the service and also for the patients. Really key. I think it is, what are you going to bring to the patient's care and their journey while you do this, or what is the impact of that? So always think about the impact that you're going to have. But have those discussions at PDR, but also go and try to find some money, because that also gives you, some weight when you go and have those discussions. It's very difficult. If I'm honest, when I first started, I used to do it in my own time. And I think there is still, if you want to do it, then you do have to give some of your own time, because even if you just do the lit review and the literature search, that's time taking, and all of those things always take longer than we think. So I think we have to go in with really clear expectations, and we also have to meet some people halfway here. Of
course. And how have you found working with student speech and language therapists?
Outstanding. I have to say, I love working with students. It makes me think. I think that's the part I have always learnt from my student colleagues who I've worked alongside. They bring a different perspective. They challenge my evidence base. That's really, I think that's key, particularly if you've worked in a specialism for a while. You hopefully you're modern and you're current, but it's very easy just to think that way, because we've always done it, and that isn't the right way. So I enjoy working with students. Absolutely would encourage anyone who's thinking about it to really open that door, and certainly to support a student project as well. Really makes you think about, is my methodology clear? Can we do something different? It's a win-win for both parties, and I would encourage it, absolutely.
Yeah, that's really great to hear, particularly as we're about to set off on our own research projects as students.
Well, you'll be brilliant, I know.
So next we want to talk about your charity work. Mm-hmm. I know you are involved in 2 UK-based charities, Cleft and Clapper, but we'll have a chat about Cleft first. I'd love to hear more about your role within the charity and what you've been involved with Cleft.
Thanks, Izzy. Yeah, and actually both charities are very close to my heart, and I'll share with you how I got involved with both of them, actually. And they both have very different perspectives, even though they are both with a focus for supporting people who are affected by Cleft. Cleft, of course, has been really in its infancy a number of years ago, and was devised and developed under Mr. Brian Summerlad, who was a consultant plastic surgeon and cleft surgeon who I had, was very fortunate to work alongside, along with my previous colleague Debbie Sell and others. And so Brian then set up the charity really with 2 arms. So there's international work, and that was really where I first got involved with developing a team in Bangladesh. So not to Bangladesh, very important, but in Bangladesh with Bangladeshi clinicians, but being supported by us and by the charity. So very much the ethos of enabling others at a local level to deliver cleft care, but knowing that we are there to support and to really advise as and when. So the international work is very much a first step, and then they also have a research arm which is really moving forward as well. And I was a speech and language therapist, and they gave me some money for a project, and that was really how I started to get involved as in that way as well. But my work and remit for them is very much within the international field as well. A while ago became a trustee, and now looking forward to, in July, becoming the vice chair of the charity. So yeah, that will take more governance. That's much more about the charity commission sort of, and working alongside the team who really manage it. But it's the international and certainly the Bangladesh team that we've developed, and we're hoping in the future to be able to develop a national centre there. So we have speech and language therapy, audiology, orthodontists, surgeons, nurses who are assigned to the team, and we go out about twice a year. But it's very much not a missions ethos. It is about empowerment, collaboration, and supporting. So that's really where we come from. Yeah, so that's the next steps, and we'll see.
Yeah. Have you seen a change in that team in Bangladesh throughout the different trips that you've been on?
Absolutely. And I think 2 years ago we went, and prior to that we had been really sitting within the main plastic surgery department. We were within it, but not really as our own identity. Then when we went back, we were now in our own site. We have a really good link to the speech and language therapy team at Dhaka University. So I go and we had a study day there, and I was joined by my previous colleague Amy Dartis, and we did a whole day's teaching. So there's very much, suddenly there was this collaboration that we had been sort of slowly developing, but then suddenly it sort of really blossomed. And for me, what was really meaningful was to see the team there really, really functioning just as one team. You could bring that whole team and move them into Great Ormond Street. They worked in the same way. They thought as a cohesive team, thinking about their patients. You know, they have many different challenges. If you think about the actual population in itself, if you think about the geography, how they sort of the social economic aspects of it, very different challenges, but they were managing that so well for their families and their patients. So it was really great to see this one team work as one in their own unit, and that really took a shift and was such a positive thing to see. Yeah. So slowly you get there.
It's so interesting to hear about the international trips. I know that a lot of newly qualified SLTs or student SLTs would be really interested in getting involved with things like that. Do you have any advice, or people just setting out into how they could get involved in these international trips?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really good way of developing skills, because it takes you out of your comfort zone. It makes you absolutely think about the tools you're using, the assessments. You won't have all the smart kit that we have here. You are there in a very different environment, and it makes you stand on your own 2 feet and have to think really differently. And I would say to anyone who's interested is to reach out to the charities, have a look. There's a number out there, but be mindful that many will go, and this isn't criticising because everybody works differently. Many will go, they will arrive in their team, with their team, and they will really, the thinking is that the surgery is the most important, which of course it is, but they don't look at the longer term MDT, and they don't look at all those other aspects that we've talked about. So you want to sense check that there is a multidisciplinary approach that's within their ethos, that they're looking at developing skills and knowledge within the local team. So is there a local speech and language therapy university department that you can link in with? Is there another charity that's developing speech and language therapy from an educational perspective or in developing clinical skills? Can we go alongside them and perhaps work in that way with the local team? So always I would really encourage people to think about enabling and developing skills at a local level rather than being the mission that arrives, delivers and leaves, because you don't really know what you're leaving behind. And somebody somewhere will have to pick that up. And that really isn't good care. So just be considered in that way.
Yeah, so moving on to Clapper. So you've mentioned that like Cleft and Clapper work with, obviously, in the same field but work in sort of quite different ways. Could you sort of explain that a bit more, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And Clapper I have been involved in for a number of years now. And in fact, when I first joined the local regional Cleft team where I started in Cleft, on one of the Wednesdays of my first induction week, the surgeon I was with said, Marie, you might want to stay late on Wednesday because we're having a Clapper meeting. And I went, what's that I don't know what that is. So he said, well, first of all, go and look that up. And then he said, it's a patient forum. It's where we meet the patients and the parents of those who we are caring for. And that absolutely lit a fire in me. I thought, this is just how it should be. So the parents arrived, we health professionals, there's everybody drinking tea, coffee, biscuits, whatever, but really drilling down what does, not from an academic perspective, but what works well, or, your clinics are running late and can we just think about how that impacts on families, or can we do some fundraising to get some speech and language therapy resources? It was really about cohesive care, including the families and the patients, and that really was my first introduction to them. And Clapper now is really at the forefront of enabling people with advice, with support, and really with their feeding service, which is absolutely paramount in supporting new parents when their baby is born or even prenatal diagnosis. And they're able to then establish a feeding regime that gets them home, hopefully safely, feeding well, but also really developing a community of people who are affected by Cleft and working together to both inform and shape care, but also in a different way, getting the patient voice into research and really making that the journey is really as smooth as it can be. And more recently, they have been involved in the adult forum because, of course, although a lot of the care is in the early years and up until the age of 20, there are, of course, adults who have been affected by Cleft who may wish to have a review or might experience something that they wish to review with a surgical team. So they've been doing some brilliant work with the adult forum as well. So two charities, same condition, but two different ethos, but ultimately bringing and improving the lives of those both nationally and internationally who are affected by Cleft, and finding some answers within the research framework, which is what it's all about.
And what has been sort of your personal involvement with Clapper? How have you worked with the charity? So
initially just worked locally with the team that I was with, and then joined as a trustee and have been doing that for a number of years now. And then at the end of June, this year, I will step down from that role because you can only be in a trustee for a certain amount of time. And I think that's healthy because that gets new blood and new ideas. So, yes, I will be really sad to step away, but it will absolutely fly. And I wish it well for the future, as I do for Cleft, because they are both really important for the Cleft community. And I feel honoured to have been part of them.
Yeah, they sound like two amazing organisations.
They are, and if you want to find out more, we have websites and all sorts. So, please reach out to us. We are here to answer questions and happy to hear thoughts and suggestions that people might have.
Thank you.
So, I think we're on to our last question now. We like to ask everyone that comes onto the podcast a piece of advice they wish they had received as a newly qualified or about to qualify speech and language therapist.
Oh, Izzy and Joe, I love this question, and I've probably spent about a day and a half thinking about it. And it's such a good question. Perhaps our CSLT should do a survey, because I think it's a really good thing. And I chatted to a friend yesterday about it. So what do I wish I had been told? That I will not know all the answers. There are colleagues and wider SLT community who are there to support and advise and also build your network, because they are the people who will support you. That I think I arrived on my first day thinking I should know about everything, and I certainly knew very quickly that I didn't. And also that I just want to take a minute to acknowledge that community can be challenging because you don't know what's walking through the door. I've worked in a specialist service. I know exactly what's that area that I'm looking at when the child walks through the door or the young person, but also I am a speech and language therapist, so I will look at that total communication profile. So I think to acknowledge that as fantastic as community can be, that you won't know all those answers. But do reach out, because there will be people out there and within our SLT community to help and advise. And it's fine to say you don't know.
Yeah, I think that's definitely very reassuring to hear for us. So yeah, I'd just like to say a huge thank you for everyone that's listening, and obviously Marie for coming and joining us today. The websites to the charities that we spoke about will be in the podcast description, so if anyone does want to take a look, you can find them there. So today we spoke about a range of things, from specialising in Cleft as a speech and language therapist, conducting research while practising, and opportunities to work with charities and go on international trips.
And Izzy and Joe, just to say thank you so much for this opportunity, for enabling me to tell you about my journey, but also about the charities that I'm involved in. I don't know what your next topic will be, but I'm sure it will be rich and diverse, and I look forward to hearing it when I check in for the next podcast. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much.